The best we can gauge is that remote work was about 5 to maybe 10% of the workforce before the pandemic. That surely looks like it's going to grow to about 20%. So it's going to double. Part-time remote is going to be more.
Richard Florida is the author of several bestsellers on urban policy and a professor at the University of Toronto's School of Cities.
The big impact of the pandemic is not about who's going to move to the suburb and who's going to move to this rural area. We now know that a lot of that's been overblown. The big impact is on the office districts. There, I think, looking forward, you could project a 20 to 30% decline in office occupancy.
You've written that the impact of the pandemic on central business districts is as great a challenge as deindustrialization was in the past. What do you mean?
If you look at this skyline behind me, that was originally built up as a place to pack and stack office workers. Before we had computers, digital technology could share on the internet. It was like a factory for information processing. What's happening now is, I think, this year-long experiment in the pandemic has shown us that people no longer need to work that way.
Do you think part of the solution is to convert office towers into affordable housing?
Yeah, I think the point is, how do we remake these office districts in ways that are not only just better economically, but more inclusive and better for a broader range of people? And we have to convert office towers and hotels and you know, these residential luxury buildings that they thought were going to be built for the plutocratic class.
Skinny condo towers for the wealthy now loom half empty over the city. Meanwhile, more than 200 hotels are shuttered, according to the head of the Hotel Association of New York, VIJAY DANDAPANI.
The hotel business fell off a precipice in March of last year, and it really hasn't recovered. The real occupancy is between 15 and 20% on average for the whole city.
The return of office workers is even more important than tourism to reopening hotels.
Business travelers absolutely pay the most money. Tourists, stay and we value their business, but they simply don't pay the same dollar rate.
When do you think the hotel industry is going to recover here in New York?
Not before 2025, because that's how long it takes for conventions, conferences to come back. Our estimate is 20% of the inventory of New York hotels is just going to go away either to other uses or be torn down completely and be rebuilt as something else.
Some 5,000 of the city's 25,000 eating and drinking establishments have already gone away, and thousands more are barely hanging on. At Grand Central Station, the flow of office commuters that restaurants and other small businesses depend on has dropped 75%.
How does this compare to what it was like before the pandemic?
It's a ghost town. This place would be mobbed, people waiting for trains.
Sandy INGBER is the executive chef at the Oyster Bar, a legendary seafood restaurant and watering hole at Grand Central that hopes to reopen soon.
Why are places like the Oyster Bar so important to the vitality of New York? I mean, when you're in this restaurant and it's full up, what does it feel like?
It's an amazing feeling. It's loud, it's busy, and we have a lot of happy people. It's something about New York, it's a real food town. I mean, there's so many foodies here. Restaurants are a very, very important employer in New York City. And the chain of supplies it affects, from meat, dairy, vegetables, everything that a restaurant has to purchase, and down the line, it has affected everybody.
Last September, the Oyster Bar tried to reopen at 25% capacity, the state limit at the time.
And after 8 days, it just wasn't sustainable. 2% revenue out of 25% capacity.
How concerned are you about the change in work habits and remote work in terms of the survival of the restaurant?
It's number one on my mind. How long will it take to be back to normal, and will it ever be?
Outside the office districts, restaurants have done better. Those that managed to stay open survived by expanding takeout and offering dining in newly permitted outside areas. Vaccination, the easing of inside seating limits, and warm weather have increased business. But most places are still serving fewer customers than before the pandemic, according to the New York City Hospitality Alliance. The president of the group is the owner of a restaurant in Harlem, MELBA Wilson.
Open streets, outdoor seating was a lifeline. And you can eat your way through any culture any diverse culture around the world if you eat at the 5 boroughs in New York.
If you go around now, there's so much eating that's on outside. Has New York become Paris in that regard? Is that going to be one of the things that stays from the pandemic, do you think?
Oui. I do see a little Paris here in New York, and I'm loving it.
So are you becoming profitable again, or?
Profitable? I don't think I'll be there for a while because of the losses that we incurred. We've had a lot of closures, so we've lost quite a few. We're struggling. We are struggling. There are a lot of vacant storefronts in this city. But, you know, at this point, I'm happy to say we're hiring more people. We are putting people back to work. That's what's important.
In the decade before COVID-19, restaurants and bars were the main source of employment for less educated workers in New York. Today, there are 135,000 fewer of these jobs.
What's been the impact on workers from the difficulties the restaurant industry has faced?
A lot of them, for the first time, have found themselves at food pantries, at food banks. And a lot of them have found themselves on welfare for the first time. You have so many people dealing with mental illnesses as well as homelessness. So the impact that it's had on our industry and on our people is devastating.
And it's also been devastating in terms of illness and death. People of color in the city were twice as likely as whites to be hospitalized from COVID-19 and 1.5 times more likely to die.
We referred to this as a new strain of inequality. So compounding the long-standing economic inequality associated with wage and wealth disparities, the pandemic hit hardest at people of color.
One neighborhood hit hard by COVID-19 is Flushing, Queens, which has a large Asian and Latino population, many of them undocumented immigrants. Elmhurst Hospital, which had one of the highest death rates in the city last year, is just a few miles from this food pantry.
Dear God, thank you very much for the food that you have given us today.
Pedro Rodriguez and his organization La Jornada run the food bank.
When the pandemic hit, people were coming from everywhere. We call it a tsunami. We were not ready for it. But at the end of the year, we were serving close to 11,000 families.
Is it only Queens where you'd see food lines like this?
No, you can see them everywhere in New York. The need is incredible.
You help a lot of immigrants. Where are they from?
They are from everywhere. We have like 14 different languages spoken in this line alone. You know, thousands of people were sick in this community and no work, no food. And I see them suffer like nobody had suffered before this year.
Immigrants make up almost half of New York City's workforce.
What are the jobs that people were doing before COVID? People that are coming to this pantry.
They are the people who took care of you in your restaurant. They are the people who took care of you in your laundromat. Every kind of service industry that you had was taken away.
I used to work in the hotel industry. I've been out of work for a year now.
Are you going to be able to go back to your work?
They pretty much terminated the whole staff. So from the way it looks, they're not going to hire us back.
What kind of work were you doing before COVID hit?
做餐馆的，因为餐馆都关掉了，很多餐馆都关掉了，很多人都在家里不敢出来吃饭啊。
Yo tengo trabajo antes aquí, pues en construcción, restaurante y cualquier cosa.
Have the programs that are provided by the government, have you been able to access them at all?
Yo nunca recibo ninguna ayuda del gobierno. Yo pago taxes, todos los taxes de muchos años. Estamos pagando, pero ningún tipo de ayuda.
Soon after we went to the food bank, the New York State Legislature passed a $2.5 billion excluded workers fund to help undocumented immigrants with food and rent. But difficulties in accessing the money remain.
Whether we're talking about food security or about small business help to get people through this period, there's a wide band of social services that need to be strengthened.
Thomas Daja is the author of the recently released book, New York, New York, New York. It examines the city's history from its flirt with bankruptcy in the 1970s to the 2000s under former Mayor Michael Bloomberg.
Immigrants have really saved the city in these 40 years. Without the vast wave of immigration over that time, we would not have done what we did here.
About 300,000 people left New York because of the pandemic. But since the 1970s, the city has attracted a steady flow of immigrants. Today, it is estimated that around 3 million New Yorkers were born in another country.
If we're talking about a few 100,000 people moving or leaving, We can absorb that. There were under 7 million people in 1978, and now we're talking about 8.5. So whether we're talking about restaurants or hip hop or real estate agents, these are people who came from all parts of the world and contributed immensely to the city and really recharged it. It led to blocks of rubble being turned into housing again and neighborhoods coming back, crime going down. They played major roles.
Concern about crime is rising again. In 2020, the city recorded 462 murders, an increase of 45%. And shootings have surged, similar to what has happened in other American cities during the pandemic.
What we're looking at today is serious and real and deadly, but it is still nothing compared to where the city has been in the past, where you had, 2,200 people a year being murdered. So I think we are well within our ability to control it.
Crime is also up on the subway system, due in part to the steep drop in ridership from the pandemic. The subway is critical to the city's recovery, and earlier this year, it faced cuts in service of up to 40% due to reduced revenue. But President Biden's American Rescue Plan provided $6.5 billion to keep the subway running at full strength through 2024.
Help is on the way. This is the most significant piece of legislation in so many ways in decades.
Championed by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who hails from Brooklyn, the rescue package allocated $100 billion to New York State and its residents. Many cities around the world face major revenue shortfalls as a result of the pandemic. Luckily for New York, Democrats are in control in Washington and can provide much-needed funds. The Biden administration is now pushing for a $2 trillion infrastructure bill, which would provide additional money for the city.
It's the single largest investment in American jobs since World War II.
President Biden's American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan that he's put forward, is absolutely critical to our recovery.
KATHRYN WYLDE is the president and CEO of the Partnership for New York, which represents many of the city's largest companies. In 2019, led by the financial sector, New York City comprised 10% of the entire U.S. economy.
The New York economy is absolutely critical to the United States, and we are the gateway to the global economy for the American economy in many, many respects.
Do you think the pandemic could change that?
I don't think the pandemic changes New York's role in the economy. I think that we can, with our public policies, change it. So New York has moved politically far to the left, and we've had major tax increases. When people have been working remotely, that can, in fact, have a major discouragement factor for bringing talent back to the workplace, particularly in the financial services industry.
Shouldn't the wealthy and those who are doing better be willing to make more of a contribution to the recovery of the city?
Absolutely, and they're doing that both through their taxes and through their philanthropic contributions. But there was a decision to make the rich pay more. It's become sort of a class warfare. And that's not how New York City has worked in the past. It's not what's going to drive our recovery.
Thank you, New York. Let's move this city.
But addressing inequality exacerbated by the pandemic is a central theme of the New York City mayor's race that is currently underway.
I'm KATHRYN Garcia. I want this city to work for every family.
The impact of COVID-19, along with protests connected to the George Floyd killing, have created new pressures for change.
We're facing a crisis unlike anything we've ever seen before. But with the right leadership, we will rise up again.
A June primary will decide the candidates for the November general election. The Democratic nominee will likely become mayor in one of the most consequential campaigns in New York's history.
The city is terribly divided. It's divided by class, it's divided by race, it's divided by where people live. And I think New York needs a mayor who's going to pull the city together and can be a mayor of everybody.
What do you think the next mayor should focus on in terms of the city's recovery?
We need to bring people back to work. That's the number one thing. We need to bring the tourists back. We need to welcome people who spend money, who provide the jobs, that allow taxes to be collected, people to pay their rent, put food on the tables. We need to be welcoming.
A lot of these jobs are not going to come back. And because of the pandemic, technology is more important, e-commerce is more important. The challenge that New York City is facing now is commensurate with what the city faced after World War II, where tens of thousands of people from the military service re-entered civilian jobs. And we should be planning for that and putting in place the training programs to make sure that we don't have a prolonged and deep unemployment crisis.
Merchants in our neighborhood are coming to us and said, listen, I'm behind more than 6 months that they can pay.
Thousands of small businesses and hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers are also facing eviction. The state eviction moratorium expires on August 31st.
You compared it last year to a tsunami.
Yes.
Has the tsunami passed?
No, we're still under the water. The jobs are not here. People are behind the rent. And I hope that vaccination will create work for all these people. And if that happens, then we will come out okay.
Vaccination is changing life in New York by the day. At a recent pro basketball game, fans had to prove they'd been vaccinated or had a recent COVID test to get in. 15,000 felt safe enough to crowd together again in the stands.
Some people say that New York won't come back until Broadway comes back, and Broadway won't come back until New York comes back.
Yes, I think Broadway probably has the most demanding path, but gradually, I think people will be more comfortable that they're safe in those kind of closed spaces, right? And the vibe of the city feels much different to me than it did a few months ago. And so I think New York will be back. New York's doom has been predicted many times.
Historically, epidemics and other catastrophes have been catalysts for progress in cities. That could be one of the legacies of COVID-19 as well.
With the vaccine, of course, there's hope, you know. In my belief, like the international tourists will start to come maybe in December. We are hoping something for Christmas. And then it will continue, hopefully, little by little. And it's so important that we have all the people back in Times Square. I mean, New York has to be alive again, you know. And we're going to come back strong. Strong. Way better, I think. Way better than how it used to be.